We usually think of Vikings as fighters and raiders. What's not often told is what happened after the battle was done. When the weapons dropped and the shield walls broke apart, the real nightmare started. Not for the men who died. Their pain was finished. It was for their wives, their daughters, and every woman still alive in a captured village. What the Vikings did to them made death look easier. You may think you already know Viking cruelty, but the old stories barely hint at it. If you care about true Viking and Norse history, follow our work and share where you're listening from. This script is based on Ibn Fodlan's writings and archaeological findings from Dublin slave markets. When the monastery at Clonmacnoise was attacked, 43 monks were killed defending their church. The records speak of the killing, but they stop when it comes to the women. Yet we know what happened, because the chains remain. Digs at Dublin's Wood Quay uncovered the setup of Viking slave trade. Iron chains made for women's wrists, ankle rings for children, even the remains of warehouses that stored human beings. The Dublin Vikings wanted more than silver or gold. They wanted people. A captured woman was not seen as a person but as property. Prices were set, 20 silver coins for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 if she was hurt. These prices show up on runic carvings from Schleswig, like receipts written in stone. But being sold could almost be called lucky. In Portmerrick, Irish records say 47 warriors were killed. But they don't mention the 53 women found afterward. Soil samples from nearby bogs reveal the truth. Bodies of 23 women were uncovered. Every one showed signs of abuse before death. Skull blows from behind, defensive cuts on arms, ribs broken from beatings. These were not deaths in battle. They were killings after capture, carried out slowly. Tests show they happened within days of the raid. These women didn't die fighting. They died after surrender, when the Vikings had time to decide. And the choice was always the same. When the great heathen army defeated the Saxons, the records tell of the king's fall. They don't tell what happened to the royal women. But the ruins of the old palace still carry stains of blood, enough for many deaths. Viking war culture had rules, but they were cruel. A dead man's wife was claimed by his killer. Not as a helper, but as a wife. This was forced marriage. The old word was kona, a woman treated as property. Icelandic law books make the process clear. The man declared the woman his before witnesses. She had no say, no escape. It was legal. Children born from it were counted as rightful. The law even set time limits. The man had 3 days to claim her. If not, other men could fight for her, as if she were livestock. And forced marriage was not even the worst fate. In other raids, monasteries were wiped out completely, and the rituals that followed were even darker. Archaeology from similar sites shows burned layers filled with bones. Many were women's bones, laid out in certain patterns. Viking funeral rites often required sacrifice. When a powerful warrior died, everything he owned was burned with him, his weapons, his horses, and even women. In 921, Ibn Fodlan saw this on the Volga. He described how a slave girl was raped and then killed at her master's funeral. That is one account, but the bones prove it was common. In graves of Viking warriors, female skeletons show signs of strangling. Some teeth and bones also carry traces of poison. The women were drugged first so they would not resist. The killings were careful, planned. The drugs came from plants. Seeds of henbane have been found at burial sites. They carry chemicals that cause visions and weakness. The women likely died seeing illusions. Maybe that was seen as kindness. Maybe it was worse. English records mention raids, stolen cattle, and burned churches. They don't say what happened in the camps. But garbage pits do. Infant bones have been found there. Dozens of them. Each shows signs of being killed on purpose. These were not stillborn. They were murdered. The babies came from Viking raids, children born to captive women. They were not wanted. The bones show they were killed quickly, heads crushed with a single blow. The Vikings were not acting out of rage. It was routine. Law was clear. If a mother was a slave, her child was also a slave. If a child couldn't work, it was killed. It was treated as simple economics. Records from Norman times show the same thing. Whole villages in Yorkshire had missing women. The gaps match Viking settlement areas. And the graves confirm it. At Repton, the Viking army's winter camp, 249 skeletons were found. Only 63 were women. That number doesn't fit. Women don't vanish unless they are taken. Testing of the bones shows those women were not locals. They came from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, lands that had been raided. The ones buried there died of sickness or childbirth. The others were sent away. Dublin was more than a Viking town. It was a hub for the slave trade. Ships arrived often with new captives. Women were divided by age and health. The younger ones were sent to Viking homes as breeding wives. The older ones were shipped to markets in the east through the Russian rivers. Wood from Dublin's docks shows they were rebuilt many times between 841 and 970. The trade kept growing. Every new dock meant more people held in chains. Warehouses could hold 200 at once. Stone floors even had drains, not for rain but for human waste. These were prisons, not temporary stops. Writings from Arabic travelers in the 9th century describe Viking slave groups reaching Baghdad. There, women brought the highest prices. Fair-skinned women from Germanic and Celtic lands were treated as luxury goods. The Vikings knew what buyers wanted, and they supplied it with skill. The eastern trade route passed through Novgorod and Kiev, stretching 1,000 miles along the Dnieper River. Cargo lists carved in runes show people counted next to furs and amber. 20 women per ship was the usual load. But the worst fate wasn't slavery, or forced marriage, or even sacrifice. It was what happened to the women who resisted. When Irish forces retook Dublin from the Norse, the records describe victory but stay silent on what was found outside the walls. Excavations there uncovered punishment pits, stone-lined holes made for slow deaths. The skeletons show clear signs: legs broken so they couldn't run, arms broken so they couldn't take their own lives. Each pit measured about 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Too small to lie flat, too short to stand upright. The women died crouching, over days or even weeks. Viking laws mention this penalty for slaves who harmed their masters. Burial alive. But not a quick one. The pits allowed air but no escape. Death came from thirst, cold, or exhaustion. Soil tests prove bodies stayed there long enough to rot slowly. It was intentional. Some pits had sharp stones at the base. Others were filled with standing water. The aim wasn't just to kill, but to make the suffering public. Other captives saw it. They understood the warning. When King Harald Fairhair brought Norway under his rule, wars at home ended and expansion slowed. But the slave trade didn't end, it became more organized. Routes turned into fixed schedules. Traders could promise delivery dates for people, just like goods. Byzantine treaties even listed slave prices. Young women sold highest. Pregnant women were cheaper. Children under 10 barely counted. The trade was advanced, calculated. Later, at the Battle of Brunanburh, 5 kingdoms united against the Norse and won. In the baggage left behind, they found portable cages. Iron frames meant for carrying humans. Chain sets sized for children. Mobile slave markets that moved with the army. These pens could lock together for larger groups or break down for travel. The design was simple, effective, terrifying. Each could hold a dozen adults or 20 children. Iron rings worn down from constant use show they were used often. This wasn't rare cruelty, it was a system. Women from fallen warriors weren't just spoils of war. They were the target. They were treated as resources to be captured, stored, and traded. The Viking economy depended on their labor. Archaeology of Viking towns shows the same pattern everywhere. Holding sites in settlements. Processing centers in ports. Built into the landscape. When Eric Bloodaxe died at Stainmore, the last Viking kingdom in England fell. But the slave network didn't disappear. Christian rulers took over the same structures. They didn't destroy them, they renamed them. Monastery records begin to mention indentured servants in large numbers. These were the same enslaved women, under new labels. The words changed. The reality didn't. And even after the Viking Age ended, mass graves show the violence went on. Women executed in groups, their deaths timed with Viking defeats. When Viking power began to fall, the evidence had to be erased. Witnesses had to be silenced. But new findings at Repton change what we know. A sealed grave from 986 holds the remains of 236 women. All show signs of execution. Tests prove they weren't captives. They were Norse women. The grave lines up with the years when Viking control in England collapsed. English armies were advancing, Norse towns were failing. These women weren't enemy prisoners. They were Viking wives and daughters, killed so they wouldn't be taken. The methods were the same ones used on captives: blows to the head, strangling, poison. Soil samples show the deaths took place over several days. This wasn't done in panic. It was planned. Fathers killed daughters. Husbands killed wives. They knew what would happen if their women were captured. The written records never mention this. The sagas are silent. But the bones show the truth. Facing defeat, the Vikings turned their violence inward, using it on their own. In the Repton grave, one more detail was found. A runic carving on a skull. It held 3 words, "I'm better this way." Someone carved it as a defense. Even in killing, they needed to explain themselves. The skull belonged to a girl, only 12 to 14 years old. Tests show she was born in Norway, brought to England as a child, and killed by her own people to keep her from capture. The carving was made after she died, a final message. But Viking violence against women wasn't only about raids. It was written into their laws. Iceland's Grágis Code spelled out the rules for claiming women. The captor had to say it in public with 3 witnesses. Her refusal didn't matter. If she killed herself to escape, her family had to pay the captor compensation, 40 silver marks. That was more than most men earned in a year. When Ethelred became King of England, his first decree addressed Viking slave trading. Not to end it, but to tax it. Records from London show standard fees: 5 silver coins for each woman, 2 for each child. The English weren't shocked by Viking practices. They wanted a share of the profit. Underwater archaeology shows how large the trade was. Shipwrecks from the North Sea carried special holds for human cargo, ventilation, storage for water, built for long trips. These weren't makeshift slave ships. They were designed for it. The biggest one found could hold 80 people. The wood dates it to 912. It burned at sea. 80 women chained below deck died there. But some women resisted in ways the records barely mention. One name survives, Gunhild, written into Frankish accounts. Gunhild was described as a freed Norse captive who turned against her former oppressors. She knew how Vikings fought, what they feared, and where they were weak. Her campaign lasted 7 years. Frankish records say she destroyed 12 Viking camps and freed more than 300 captives. She fought like they did, striking fast, showing no mercy, taking no prisoners. Her last attack hit the slave market at Rouen. Sources from the time describe the systematic killing of every Viking trader in the city. 47 men died. The method was always the same, castration first, then slow bleeding. After 930, her name disappears from written accounts. But digs at Viking sites along the Seine reveal burn layers from this period. Someone was hunting Vikings, and they knew exactly how to cause fear. The custom of claiming conquered women spread beyond Scandinavia. Norman records in the 11th century describe the same practice in England. William's knights were given land grants that listed all chattels, and chattels included women. The Domesday Book recorded this like inventory. Manor entries put livestock, crops, and women in the same lists. Women were valued as property, nothing more. Excavations at Norman castles show how this system worked. Courtyards held cells built only for women. Thick stone, iron doors, no windows. Some cells held up to 30 at once. Analysis of bones from castle garbage pits shows infant death rates near 100%. The children of forced unions almost never survived. This wasn't neglect, it was intentional. Mixed children were evidence of rape. Evidence had to be erased. In 1066, Harold Godwin's son died at Hastings. England fell to the Normans, and their conquest followed Viking rules step for step. Saxon women were seized, forced into marriages with Norman knights. Laws turned rape into marriage. Chroniclers at the time framed it as improving Saxon blood. Today, we would call it ethnic cleansing by sexual violence. The system was the same as the Vikings. Only the excuse was different. Marriage contracts from this era show the money behind it. Saxon heiresses were traded not for love, but for their land rights. Rape acted as a transfer of property. The woman's consent was meaningless in law. Church records reveal resistance. Some Saxon women chose death over marriage. Convent numbers tripled in the 10 years after Hastings. Suicide rates among noblewomen rose sharply. The Church called these deaths martyrdoms. The state called them destruction of property. Genetic research gives the clearest proof. Studies of medieval cemeteries show DNA mixing that follows the same routes as the slave trade. Celtic and Saxon maternal lines appear in Scandinavian populations from the 9th century onward. This was not migration. It was forced breeding. Modern Icelanders carry about 60% Celtic female ancestry. Norwegians show 40% ancestry from women of the British Isles. These numbers represent thousands of captive women, thousands of forced pregnancies, and children who never knew their mothers' true identities. The scale was massive. The process was organized. Records were destroyed, but not everything was lost. Excavations at Jorvik uncovered a building no one knew existed. Dating shows it was built in 876. Inside were 64 small cells, each with chains set into the walls. This was not a prison. It was a breeding center. Tests on the soil show it was used for 40 years. Bone fragments reveal that hundreds of women passed through. All were female, all forced into repeated pregnancies, and all discarded when no longer useful. This building stood in the center of York. Everyone knew it was there. Church baptismal logs even record the births, 732 in total. Only 12 children lived past age 5. The rest were listed as foundlings, with no parents named. They were taken as servants for rich families. The money made from it was used to build churches. Holy work was paid for by organized rape. Records from York Minster show steady payments to the operators of these places, clear business deals, not gifts or bribes. The church wasn't just involved, it was a partner. This system was the same across Viking lands. Every big town had such places. Every church kept the same type of records. Every authority shared the profits. The setup was wide, the money huge, and the pain beyond words. Soil tests at Repton reveal the darkest truth. The grave of Norse women there held more than victims of one execution. Lower layers show many burials spread over 50 years. It wasn't a single massacre, it was repeated killing. Whole generations of Viking women were wiped out to cover the crimes. Bone tests show they were poisoned with mercury. It wasn't fast poison. It worked slowly, driving them mad before death. Women lost their minds and couldn't speak clearly about what they had seen. Even survivors had no voice, because madness made their words worthless in law. It was the perfect way to silence them. New digs at Repton have also found children's remains with the women, mothers and children killed together so no one could pass on the truth. Tests show the victims weren't random. They were chosen carefully, women who worked as interpreters, women who ran the slave houses, women who knew too much. Even in death, Viking women had no freedom, no chance, no way out. In that grave, one detail stood out. A skull with a runic carving. 3 words in Old Norse, better this way. Someone stopped in the middle of killing to carve an excuse. Even while murdering, they wanted to believe they were right. They knew exactly what fate awaited captured wives.